Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video. Well, I'm excited about this one because we put this up for a vote over on Patreon. We now have 44 patrons, so thank you to each and every one of the 44 of you, as well as to everyone who continues to subscribe, hit that like button, leave comments. Every one of you is supporting this channel, and I'm grateful for that. You are an important part of this community that we're building around this. So I put it up for a vote, and the overwhelming choice for my next reaction series from Extra History is Bismarck. I know a lot of you have been asking for this one for quite a while, probably one of my most requested video series to do. So we're going to dive into it today. A couple of quick things as we get into this. I believe the first video is mostly about his younger years and kind of his upbringing, things like that. I don't know a whole lot about the early years of Otto von Bismarck. I know much more about his time in government. I think my own personal opinion, and probably a lot of people would agree with this, that probably the single most influential person in creating the Europe that led to World War I. And he was born actually in the spring of the year that the Napoleonic Wars came to an end. So he's very much a person who bridges the world of Napoleonic era to the modern era. And much of his life overlaps and is responsible for. And we've talked about this before, about how you can look at each era of history and how it directly leads into the next one. You can look at the Napoleonic Wars and see how they lead into the world that creates the Franco-Prussian War, which leads directly into the creation of the world in which we have World War I, which leads into World War II, which leads into the Cold War, and so on and so forth. So I'm excited to have a conversation about this. So let's dive into the early years of Otto von Bismarck and use the comment section below to talk about what the video talks about, and we'll continue this conversation in the days ahead.
You cannot always tell the character of a man from the character of his youth. 1878, the Congress of Berlin. A graying man with a proud walrus mustache stands and says, "Europe today is a powder keg, and the leaders are like men smoking in an arsenal. A single spark will set off an explosion that will consume us all. I cannot tell you when that explosion will occur, but I can tell you where. Some damned foolish thing in the Balkans will set it off."
So this is almost 40 years before the events that take place in the Balkans lead to a world war that kills tens of millions of people. And here's this 63 or so year old man predicting that was going to happen. This just gives you a little bit of a glimpse, and I'm so glad they started with this, a little bit of a glimpse into the political and military acumen that this guy had. He was a genius when it came to these things. He's the one who created the alliances and the map of Europe that led to those events happening. But I'm sure we'll talk about that.
1897. A prince in the middle of his life goes to visit the man, the old man now. It is the last time the two will meet, for the younger Wilhelm II dismissed this old man years before. But as their visit concludes, the old man issues a warning. He says, "Your Majesty, so long as you have this present officer corps, you can do as you please. But when this is no longer the case, it will be very different for you." Then he says, "The crash will come 20 years after my departure if things go on like this." The old man will die in July of 1898. In November 1918, that prince, Wilhelm II, will abdicate the throne, having lost the backing of his army in the disaster that was the First World War.
Again, look at the prediction. Look at the brilliance of this. He's literally 20 years later is when he steps down. And both Wilhelm II and Tsar Nicholas, the moment at which they lost their empires was the moment at which they lost the support of their military high command. And in both cases, that was what led directly. It wasn't necessarily just the lack of support among the people, because you can lose the support of the people if you still have the military, but you lose the military too, and you're done. And that's what happens to Wilhelm II.
Bismarck's prediction was off by only 4 months. Such was the mind that would use Europe for a chessboard and redraw the map forever. But this was something that few could see in his youth. Otto's time in grade school was middling, and we know little of his early teenage years. But at 17, when he enters college, we begin to get a picture of the man.
So I guess we're not going to talk about his early years. I don't know a lot. I know that he comes from a military background. I believe his father was a Prussian military officer. His mother was the daughter of some government official. And so he has that kind of background already, both government on his mother's side and military on his father's side. He grows up in Saxony. I know he liked to wear military uniforms in his younger days. I don't know a whole lot else. I know he had some brothers. I don't think he was an oldest child.
6 feet of dashing, with a tousled mane of copper blonde hair, often seen walking not with a walking stick, but with a twisted staff of iron. He cut a dashing figure. Classes weren't really for him. He stopped going almost immediately, preferring Byron and Walter Scott as tutors to any other. He was quick with words and equally quick to a challenge. He got himself into more than one duel per month while he was at his first university.
More than one duel per month while he was at university. So that gives you a real picture of the guy's personality. And he's a big dude, too. I mean, 6 foot is a decent height now. But back then, the average height was a few inches shorter than it is today. So 6 foot would have been a significant height in the 1830s, I guess, when he'd be growing up.
Engaging in 26 contests of honor and being wounded only once. To his dying day, he would insist that he was only wounded because his opponent's rapier broke. He consumed monumental amounts of alcohol, discovered a profound, if not so profound, love of the fairer sex, and managed to rack up a small mountain of debts. Most intriguing of all, though, he got himself cast as a character named Otto von Bismarck when his roommate wrote a novel about their wild college life. By the way, this man, who was quite aptly named Motley, would soon become a historian of some note, and one of the diplomats who kept Europe from siding with the Confederacy in the American Civil War. Anyway, that wild college life of theirs eventually caught up to Otto, and he moved to Berlin both to attend law school and to dodge the consequences of his roguish ways. Still rooming with Motley, he never once went to class while in law school. But when graduation time drew near, he hired what is politely known as a crammer at the last minute, and managed to pass the exam to become a practitioner of law.
I say good for him. If he could kind of just do that and then pass anyway, it tells you a little something about his intelligence, maybe not about his work ethic, maybe not too good things to be said about his decision-making at that time in his life, but how many of us can say we really always made good decisions at that age anyway?
And all the while, he read voraciously. Not only romantic poets, but also history, economics, and philosophy. Although not the heady abstractions of Hegel or Kant that were the rage at the time. By the time he left law school, he felt ready for a career in the diplomatic service. Unfortunately, the foreign minister did not hold a high opinion of the diplomatic abilities of Prussian nobility, and preferred to hire from without. So, rather than being assigned some glorious foreign posting, Bismarck was soon sent to Aachen, a territory taken from the French in the Napoleonic Wars, and he was given the job of figuring out how to better integrate it into Prussia.
And Aachen, that is the, and I don't know if that's how it's pronounced or not, I've been told it isn't, but I don't know what the right pronunciation is. That is where the cathedral is that Charlemagne is buried in. One of the places definitely on my list of places I want to visit when I get a chance. It's right on the border, the western border of Germany there.
This task never really captured his interest. It was the English he was far more interested in, for Aachen had become a popular spa and vacation spot for the English gentry, and, more notably, their daughters. Unfortunately, he was soon canned after he overstayed a river trip with one of these daughters by 3 months. It took some significant family influence to get this self-designated leave quietly swept under the rug, and Otto was soon involuntarily volunteered for the army. But before even his year of mandatory service was done, his mother took ill and died. This tragedy finally made his path clear. His father had never been good at managing anything, and his mother had run their more unruly estates. With her passing, Otto would take over this duty. A gentleman farmer's life for him. He was completely unprepared for this task, but he did still have his secret weapon, the one expedient that had carried him through every challenge life dealt him: cramming.
So, this is often the case in people's lives, is that it takes some crisis to show us who we really are, and to show us who we need to be. And for him, there was no responsibility. There was nothing that he really took seriously. So this is obviously an event in his life that has given him a wake-up call and said, you need to do something with your life. Your mother's gone now. You need to take over, and you need to be responsible. And some people, they shrink from that, and that drives them even further off a cliff. Other people, that forms them into a great person. And in Otto von Bismarck's case, it made him into a great person.
So as his military service wrapped up, he devoured books on agricultural science, estate management, and economics. He even managed to get himself into a soil chemistry course at a nearby agricultural institute. Armed with this knowledge, he set to his task with vigor. And so, even as the agricultural markets of Northern Europe collapsed around him, his estate grew in value, and his diligence was matched only by his eccentricity. He became known for unpredictable behavior, like marking his entrance into a neighbor's house by firing a pistol into their ceiling, or...
Wait, what? I've never heard that one before. Announcing yourself by firing a pistol? Hey, I'm here! That is awesome. This guy should have been in the Wild West in America at this time. I'm starting to really like this dude a lot.
Or releasing foxes into people's drawing rooms. He earned the nickname the Wild Man Bismarck from the locals, and, as always, from the local ladies as well. But this wild man treated his laborers well, much better than their ceilings and drawing rooms anyway, and he further devoted himself to his studies, diving deep into history, poetry, English politics, and even philosophy.
Look at this variety of backgrounds. The fact that this guy just absorbs knowledge, but not only absorbs the knowledge, but then turns around and uses it. You know, he absorbed knowledge about farming so that he could be better at managing estates. No wonder he was such an incredible diplomat, such an incredible warrior, but also peacemaker. This guy learned about everything he could get his hands on.
Though he did still have a preference for Spinoza over the German philosophers that were informing many of his more liberal colleagues' thoughts at the time. All of this, and perhaps age, began to refine him, to smooth out his roughest edges. And though country life weighed heavy on him, in many ways he was well suited for it. It looked as though the life of a country squire was to be his calling. Over time, he settled in, he made friends. He even married a woman who seemed wholly unsuited to him. A quiet, devout woman with no interest in politics or English poetry. But she made him quite happy. In fact, he adopted her religion, pietism, to marry her. And such is the strange character of Bismarck that he did so earnestly, or at least he adopted the parts of her faith which he earnestly found compelling. But her father doubted that Otto was sincere in his conversion. This was the wild man Bismarck, after all. But Bismarck had a plan. Bismarck always has a plan. He wrote his beloved's father a letter detailing his path to finding faith, and when the man still hesitated, Bismarck, being Bismarck, seized the moment, tore all the way across Pomerania in the middle of winter, and showed up at the man's estate to convince him in person. When Bismarck returned from this excursion, he found on his desk a letter. It was an invitation to take charge of running the dikes on the Elbe. It may not seem like much, but it was an official position.
So there you get a sense of how tenacious he was when there was something he wanted to accomplish. This is a guy that did not give up until something was done. And he was going to convince that man of his earnestness when it came to his faith. And so he writes, he uses his education. He shows how diligent he is by going there and doing it in person, using his diplomatic skills. And this is a picture of the man that would come to the head of one of the most powerful nations on earth, who would help create that nation in the first place. And you can see how when Kaiser Wilhelm II has a guy like that number one, he's going to thrive with him running the country. Number two, he's going to feel threatened by him because of how good he is at that job. And number three, how things could fall apart when he no longer has someone like that running the country.
His time in the doghouse with the government might be over. So he attacked the work. Then, in 1847, something monumental happened.
Revolution.
The King of Prussia called a parliament. For the first time, Prussians would get together, debate, and vote on things.
And this is also a time in European history, the 1840s, where there's a lot of revolutionary undercurrent happening. There's a lot of peasants rising up and wanting to overthrow governments. There's a lot of people in those governments who want to change the form of their governments. It's a very tumultuous time in the history of Europe.
But Otto's wedding date was near, and besides, he hated Berlin, and he was a staunch conservative, believing in the power of the monarchy at a time when liberalism and democracy were in vogue.
He believed in monarchy, but I don't believe that at this point in his life he supported the idea of German unification. I don't know how widespread that notion was in the 1840s, but I know that as a Prussian, and since Prussia is by far the most powerful part of the German states, I don't think he wanted Prussia to give up their autonomy to a larger German state.
Even the idea of a parliament grated against his royalist leanings, for though this was a summoned rather than an elected parliament, it was almost certainly going to be used to push for a proper elected parliament, one which, by its very nature, must take its power from the royal government. So he was reluctant to go. Even if he were to be summoned, he might not. But then fate turned. He received another letter. An acquaintance, whose good graces he wanted to stay in, had suddenly fallen ill, and now requested that Otto take up his post as representative of the Prussian-Saxon nobility. This request made no sense, as technically Otto was not part of the Prussian-Saxon nobility. His estates were all either in Altmark or Pomerania. But never mind that, he couldn't turn down such an important request. So he made his way to the United Diet, where a push for a true parliament was already in session. Pro-democratic speeches were given. One man got up and declared that the Prussian people had only thrown back Napoleon because they were promised a constitution. This was too much. Bismarck stood and responded that the Prussian people had thrown back Napoleon for Prussia.
So interesting. And all of us in our lives can look back at those moments where the trajectory of our life changes, where if you go back to that moment and you change that moment, everything after is completely different. And you can see those series of moments in Bismarck's life. But not only for Bismarck's life, think about the trajectory of the country changing, just by simple things like him ending up going to this parliament and speaking. How might things have been different had he not been there?
Did the man really think that Prussians wouldn't have stood up against an invader without being promised a piece of paper? The hall erupted in boos. People shouted and stamped. The place was chaos. But Bismarck, being Bismarck, just picked up a newspaper and began to leisurely read through it until they were quite done.
That is such a passive-aggressive moment that I absolutely love. People are freaking out. He doesn't try to outshout them. He doesn't try to tell them why they're wrong. He just opens up a newspaper and ignores them until it stops. That's awesome.
And then he finished his speech. And in that moment, Bismarck, the country squire, became Bismarck, the statesman.
All right. Well, that's a really good start. I'm excited to dive into part 2. We will do this as a daily series until it's done. I'll also be doing some other stuff in the meantime. I'm working on getting my video edited from my following the events of Stonewall Jackson's mortal wounding at Chancellorsville, so you can be watching for that in the next few days. I'll also be putting up a new vote on Patreon for what you want to see the next reaction to be. So check those things out. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, check out the original video in the link below. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.